AI happens pretty fast. If you don't stop and look around once in a while, it might just pass you by.
Hello, and welcome back to The Reasoning Show. I'm your host, Brian Gracely, and today I've got reason to believe that we probably should start digging into how some of these companies that are building large-scale systems to process lots and lots of software inputs, both software code, software fixes, software patches, and merges, are managing it. And we're going to dive into how that's being done in real life at scale with the good folks from ChainGuard right after the break. Today's show is sponsored by ShareGate. You're out of time. Copilot needs to be deployed ASAP, but your tenant really isn't ready for it. Years of data, permissions, and users lurk in its shadows, ready to be exposed by AI. ShareGate Protect sees it all, so you can find the exposure risks, fix them fast, and deploy AI with confidence. Microsoft 365 governance, they've got this. Learn more at sharegate.com/protect. Today's show is sponsored by Nasuni. There's a growing gap in AI right now between what's possible in theory and what successfully works at scale inside an enterprise. The difference comes down to unstructured file data. Many AI initiatives struggle because the file data they depend on is scattered, unstructured, and disconnected from where and how work actually happens. Nasuni changes that. It brings your unstructured file data into a single, secure foundation so AI, both generative and agentic, can access it with the context, governance, and performance it needs in production. Bring AI to where your unstructured data lives. See what it takes to activate your data for AI and request a demo at nasuni.com/AI. We're back. And as I mentioned at the top of the show, we're going to dig into a topic today that I think is going to be really, really interesting to a lot of people as we're really starting to see just a huge change in how software is developed, how software is maintained, and hopefully how we're keeping bugs and problems out of our software. And so really excited to have Matt Moore, CTO of ChainGuard, joining us today. Matt, welcome to the show. Great to have you on.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
It's, as I was telling you just before, it's been a little while since we had Dan, your CEO, on the show when the company first launched. So it's good to have you guys back on. For folks that may not know about your background, give us a little bit about your background, and then obviously, what the things that you guys are focused on these days at ChainGuard, because it is in a very exciting space as far as software development goes.
Yeah, so a little bit about my background. I started my career working on compilers, doing compiler optimization, super low-level stuff. After doing that for 7 or 8 years, I went over to Google. That's where I met my co-founders, including Dan, who you've met. I was pretty early in the container space. I started Google's container registry team, which is how I met my co-founders. And really just, spent a number of years collaborating on different, container adjacent, open source adjacent projects in the sort of security developer tool space. And someday I'll tell it like it's a master plan where we, collaborated on all these ideas and then, ventured out and started a company to bring them all together. But really it was just us for many years, working in the space, trying to build products, seeing problems, looking around. Nobody had solved that problem. So we were like, okay, I guess we'll try and solve it. And so, we collaborated on so many things over the years that, I had sort of taken a break. I had left Google and I was at VMware briefly and had left VMware and was sort of on a career break. And as I started to get bored and think about, what I wanted to do next, I started talking to all kinds of companies. And I really never thought I'd start up, but talking to startups, it, I think gave me the itch, so to speak. And Dan had been trying to recruit me back to Google, and I Uno reverse carded him. And I was like, well, have you thought about starting a company? And he and Tim were working in the supply chain space at the time at Google. They had started the Google open source security team and, projects like SigStore and Salsa under the Open Source Security Foundation, which they helped get off the ground. And it was very timely because they started all that like right before SolarWinds. And I convinced them to, help start a company with me. And, it's such an exciting space. And, it dovetailed so nicely with many of the collaborations that we had over the years that we built ChainGuard. But ChainGuard has, one of the ways I like to describe what we do, we started with containers, building hardened containers with Zero-CVEs, bootstrapped around our own distribution to help make that Zero-CVE promise possible. But really, we've expanded to a whole, many different artifact forms, containers being one of them, VMs, libraries, et cetera, where, I think about what we do now as effectively offering our customers a secure software supply chain as a service, where everything coming from source all the way through to being distributed to our customers, is, attested with provenance all the way back to that source code, by ChainGuard, where, you see all of these supply chain attacks where folks are going after PyPI or NPM or Docker Hub or wherever else, and attacking those sort of intermediate forms to ship malware or whatever else. And, we eliminate a lot of that attack surface by owning the entire process. And by owning that entire process, we can make sure that nothing is standing between, upstream security fixes and our customers. And so that ownership of the process is really what enables us to offer SLAs and things like that around remediation or, new versions becoming available.
Yeah. Yeah, I remember when you guys were first getting started, the company was getting announced, and it was one of those, the industry was sort of abuzz because it was like, okay, that rock star's going there, that superstar's going there, that guy's really smart, that person's really, so there was a while there where people were just like, it's going to be cool to figure out what they build, and then I think it took a little while for the industry to figure out kind of what exactly you guys were doing. I think it all kind of crystallized once people were like, oh, no, they're the Zero-CVE company. Right. And I know you guys, like you said, you do quite a bit more, but I think it sort of crystallized around that. You obviously have to build a lot of process or a lot of things behind the scenes to be able to do that at scale. And then not too long ago, you guys came out and you said the thing that we had done for a while, the sort of ChainGuard Factory 1.0, we've rethought it. We're looking at ways to make it better. And you came out with something brand new. Can you kind of walk us through just what you had built in order to be able to do sort of the first phase of ChainGuard, and then really the way you're thinking about things now, just because of the pace that things are moving and unfortunately the pace of attacks and all those sorts of things?
Yeah. So, to be fair, it did take us a little while. As the supply chain space is so big, it did take us a while to sort of find the exact shape that, met the needs that customers had and really addressed a pain point. And, the CVE one is one that is just, an enormous pain point for customers. But yeah, as we sort of started to scale up, we've gone through sort of a few iterations now, but a couple of years ago, we sort of dubbed it our factory, right? Our automated processes for sort of building out container images at scale. Our CEO, Dan, and I, many years ago, built sort of the original hardened images, the Google Driftless images, which there's about 6 of them, right? To give you a sense for what a pain it was to create new versions in that sort of hardened style. But that proved the concept. And so when we were building our images product out, one of my aha moments was just, there was something I had spent hours trying to do back then and gave up. That took me like 5 minutes on top of our new purpose-built early automation. And so, we've gone way beyond 6, right? And the depth of what we do goes way beyond that. And so early on, like we use largely off-the-shelf stuff, GitHub Actions, et cetera, to build a lot of our, processes and automate a lot of our processes. But then we started to shift towards more purpose-built services for doing distribution. And so, for that infrastructure, we know and love the sort of Kubernetes model and some of the stuff around reconciliation that we do today. There really weren't great sort of primitives for us to adopt some of those practices outside of a Kubernetes cluster. And so we leaned into, EDA or event-driven architecture where, as things would happen, we would react to them. And there's a number of good examples of that where we leveraged it. And it's, great because, these things react almost immediately, right? But EDA is it's fantastic for that sort of 0 to 1. Mm-hmm. It's low latency. It demos great, but it tends to do stuff just in time, right? Which is great until the amount of traffic that comes in exceeds your ability to do things downstream, right? So a really fun example that we deal with constantly is interacting with GitHub, right? So GitHub sends us probably several orders of magnitude more events than a single GitHub app has quota to react to, right? So if we just take every event that comes to us from GitHub, and we use that to make a single API call, then we would almost constantly have an exhausted GitHub quota. And so before we built our work queue abstraction that sits underneath our reconcilers, our EDA-based image distribution would fan out. It would denial of service our registry when we would rebuild the world, because every image push to our registry would fan out and result in image pushes to all of the entitled customers. And so it became this sort of traffic cannon as the number of images we had grew and the number of entitled customers we had grew. When we built our own work queue, we finally bit the bullet. We were like, the Kubernetes patterns were solid, but like we didn't have this work queue abstraction to, when we finally bit the bullet and built we saw upwards of 90% like event deduplication. We gained sort of flow control, which, events would still queue work, which we would deal with immediately if we had capacity. So we got that sort of approximation of EDA latency if we weren't, drowning in work. But we could control how much work we did at any point in time, which allows us to sort of regulate and keep us from bringing down our downstream dependencies like R2 or, the database we have on the back end, or, even systems like GitHub and the quota capacity. And so what's interesting is as we've grown, we keep sort of outgrowing off-the-shelf things. Problems that seem really simple at small scale become like shockingly hard at the scale that we're operating. So like even really simple problems like tracking all the upstream projects that we monitor for updates is hard, because the traffic you're potentially sending to a system like GitHub checking for updates on all these projects becomes enormous, right? When the number of things in your inventory is that high.
Yeah, no, I can imagine. And it's like you said, it's hard sometimes to fathom, okay, it seems like a couple of simple tasks. Why is that so hard? But yeah, when you multiply it by hundreds of thousands or probably millions, the systems don't just necessarily work the way that you talked about it. You guys introduced a system called Driftless AF. Give us a sense of, at what point were you guys thinking, okay, the previous system isn't going to hold up? And then how much did you have to be going, okay, we've seen certain patterns happen that are breaking the old system. Like how far how far ahead do you have to think about where you take Driftless, just so you can keep up? Because you do keep taking on more and more kind of capabilities, a broader scope of what you're going to try and provide from a security perspective.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's always, I mentioned that like we started with off-the-shelf things and then we started to build more purpose-built things over time. It's always sort of an interesting balancing act to try and thread that needle, right? Because there's probably a point in time where like you're starting to feel the pain of the old system, but like, it's maybe not completely broken, but, it's starting to show its wear under that volume of load. But, you take something like reconciliation as a pattern in distributed systems, and, it's a very, very powerful way of doing things. But I think it's sometimes hard for people to sort of reason about doing things in that way. It's just such a tendency. We're so reactive as humans that like doing things in an event-driven way, what folks would call an edge-triggered way, where like, oh yes, I know I'm reacting to a push event on GitHub. Why wouldn't I just deal with, what has changed in that sort of particular event? Reconciliation-based systems take a completely different approach. Like you throw out that context and you say, I need you to look at this pull request. And you sort of don't give it any other information about why it's looking at that pull request. And you have to sort of holistically look at what needs to be done on this pull request. What's the actual state of the world, and what's my desired state of the world, and how do I bring those back into sync, right? And so like that mindset is extremely powerful in terms of building distributed systems and scaling and being resilient to errors and interruptions. But like you don't need that at small scale. So like it would be completely overkill to do that, when you're getting started, or if you have something that isn't dealing with that volume of traffic. But And things like EDA, work great there. But yeah, as you start to scale up and you start to see that where, it won't hit you in all places, right away, right? Yeah. It'll start to hit you in certain places. And the first place we started to see it was in our entitlement system, which, prompted us to invest and build out the earliest versions of our work queues. And then once we had that tool in our toolbox, we started to see more places that, we wanted to use it or wish we'd used it and move system by system over to the sort of new model, and leverage those tools. And as well as, I mentioned we started by building something we call the work queue, which was modeled after the Kubernetes work queue, almost as precisely as I could manage, because I love the Kubernetes work queue. We were big Kubernetes and sort of reconciler nerds long before we started ChainGuard. My co-founder Vile was one of the original folks on Kubernetes. And I worked with him on a project called Knative before.
Oh, sure. Yeah.
Before ChainGuard, and the reconciliation framework we built out as part of that was very powerful. It built on a lot of the stuff in Kubernetes, but added a lot of stuff on top. And so, it wasn't so much like, I think if the tools existed to have that work queue, we probably would have started to use it a lot sooner.
Yeah.
Things like AWS SQS or Google Task Queues, they seem close, but, there are things about it that don't match the sort of exact semantics of the Kubernetes work queue. And there's so many very nuanced ways. I could probably go on all day about all the little nuances of it that I loved. And none of those off-the-shelf systems really gave me the properties that we wanted. And so we finally bit the bullet. We built our own. We even addressed a number of things that I feel like Kubernetes sort of suffers from in terms of the way it uses work queues today, to make our stuff scale even bigger or be even more resilient than the Kubernetes-based work queue.
Right.
And then we started to build our own sort of reconciliation abstractions on top of our work queue once we'd proven it out on that entitlement system. And it was showing us, the entitlement system was sort of a really interesting story. I basically furiously, over the course of a long weekend, rewrote our entire entitlement system to use this. And I was fully expecting everything to go sideways as we tried to roll this thing out. And it's probably one of the smoothest rollouts I think I've ever been a part of. I was shocked at how low a concurrency we needed to keep up with all of our traffic. And it immediately resolved whole classes of issues we were seeing with the old system. And I kept holding my breath being when's it going to break? When's it going to break? When's it going to break? And it just didn't, because it's such a powerful abstraction in terms of if you miss a beat, you'll pick it up on the next reconciliation, and, and the work queue itself, if there are errors, it will retry. There's just all these really nice properties that make it such a great building block for resilient high scale systems.
Yeah. Yeah, people were probably pretty excited about you. They came in on a Monday morning and they went, "Wait, Matt rewrote the system that sort of makes sure that all of our paying customers keep staying paying customers. You did what?"
Well, I had a prototype. I didn't roll it out.
I understand.
Over the weekend, but it proved the concept, and we rolled it out over the next week or so. And it was that sort of tense period where I was like, "Oh my God, when is something going to break?" And
right.
It didn't break. And it actually took us a little while before we sort of built the next thing on top of it, in part because a lot of things were working just fine with the existing systems. But now, as we started to embrace building higher level reconciliation abstractions on top of it, the number of them throughout ChainGuard has just been exploding. I mean, in part because agents make it really easy to write code now, especially around, repeated patterns, but also because it gives folks such nice tools for building high scale services.
Yeah. You mentioned agents. You guys also open source Driftless AF. I'm going to ask kind of a big question, and I'm mostly trying to kind of get a sense of how you're thinking about this. So, right now you've got, you guys are sort of showing and proving out that you can do very large scale sort of software supply chain, but really sort of software remediation at scale. We're seeing projects like OpenClaw and some of these others that are almost entirely being pull requests are being managed by AI. The things that are coming in are being sort of managed by AI. So you have this tremendous velocity because of the ability to use agents and bots and so forth. And then obviously you've got a lot of buzz in the industry right now about Mythos and some of these models that are able to go and potentially break software and find vulnerabilities. Like, how do you guys start to think about your role in this world in which, just the acceleration of what's possible? It feels like so much has happened in the last 6 to 12 months. You're kind of right in the middle of that. Like, what are you hearing from the marketplace in terms of what you should be doing? What are you trying to think in terms of the scope? Because obviously, like you said, the scope of what's possible, how much software is out there is pretty infinite. How do you sort of think about all those things, in terms of what you should be doing or what the market's asking you to do?
Yeah, I mean, it's
a giant question. So
it's a giant question. I mean, and we hear a lot. I mean, I think the role we've started to fill for a lot of our customers, right? Like everyone uses open source. Sure. And, we have helped our customers start to adopt open source in a safer way, right? A way that, helps them avoid CVEs almost entirely, helps them avoid entire classes of malware. And so I think they start to look to us and ask us how they responsibly adopt things like this, right? You mentioned things like OpenClaw. I think while the world was abuzz with it, they were also abuzz with like just how open and lax some of the security aspects of it are, sure. Right? And some of how I think about, I love Claude. I use Claude almost constantly locally. It's mind-boggling to me that I think today is exactly 1 year from when Dan first nerd sniped me into kicking the tires on Claude and like trying it out, which blows my mind, right? Because I feel like there's been a seismic shift from things like Claude and like thinking about how much things have changed just since I started using Claude and like looking at the fact that it's been just a year since that, really started to lead to that inflection and how much has changed since then. Yeah. I mean, at this point, OpenClaw almost feels like old news. I mean, it's what, like
it's been sort of consumed into other stuff, right? Yeah.
And like that compared to where we were a year ago with Claude, it's just moving so quickly. I think that some of how I look at it, and while I love Claude, right? Like Claude is effectively like giving an LLM or an agent, bash as a tool call, right? You've given it the Swiss Army knife. You basically said you can do whatever in this system. I mean, anything you can write and run like in, that environment, which enables it to do incredibly powerful things because it can reach for CLIs. It can reach for my GitHub CLI. It can reach for my Google CLI, my AWS CLI, and interact with the world. You're sitting there smashing the, yes, I approve. Go do that for me. Right. Or, running in YOLO mode. But, I think that the way I've always looked at agents, right? And like we have a strong bias towards like how we responsibly adopt software and how we enable folks to do that safely. And a lot of it comes down to best practices, right? Yep. And so I think about things like least privilege, and I sometimes jokingly call Driftless least package. But like, if you think about, sort of what's necessary and sufficient to accomplish an agentic task, right? Okay, like giving Claude the access to all of the CLIs on your system via a shell is certainly sufficient, but is it all necessary, right? And so I think the way we orchestrate our agents, through Driftless is largely interacting with the LL APIs directly and giving them a focused set of tools that they need to accomplish, specific tasks, rather than basically giving them full shell access with some huge suite of CLI tools. And I bring that up because I think this is fundamental to how you sort of safely adopt AI, right? Yeah. And so a lot of folks are trying to orchestrate running, something like Claude directly. And because it has such powerful tools, they start to be like, okay, well, now how do I sandbox it? We sort of took a different approach. I think of it as like least tool call, right? Where, as we build, focused agents, we give them a very focused set of tools. You can extend those things through, you can extend the prompting through things like skills. You can extend the set of tool calls with things like MCPs, but the core focused set that we give it, is curated and limited to, what we need to, accomplish very specific tasks. And then, that, because none of those things involves like running code in our actual agent process, then we don't actually have to have the conversation about how we sandbox the agent, because the agent isn't actually running anything in its sort of supervisory capacity. It can delegate to other systems like our CI systems that are heavily sandboxed, right? Like we build, all of open source. So we've already solved, CI systems have already solved the sort of remote code execution as a service. And so we've heavily oriented around like running, purpose-built agents and leveraging our pre-existing, extensive pre-existing sandboxing investments in CI. We have, micro VM level isolation around all of our software builds. Right? I mean, we have very strong isolation in place for the code that might get executed as part of, our package builds and things like that. But the sort of focused agents that we run as part of Driftless, it's, it comes back to that Kubernetes principle of reconciliation. I have a desired state. I have the actual state. How do I bring those into sync? And we basically unleash agents on that, right? We basically say, okay, well, this is the state I wanted in, but this is the state it's actually in. Can you fix things up so that those two things are in sync? That may be remediating CVEs, right? Maybe there's a CVE in something and it has to upgrade some dependencies or do something else in order to make those CVEs go away. Maybe we need to pick up the latest version of a piece of software. Maybe we picked up an update and it broke one of our tests because maybe something about the test was testing an old or deprecated component in an upstream piece of software, or some functionality that got removed from that upstream. Maybe the test needs to be changed or go away. Maybe it needs to be migrated to the new version of a feature. Agents can sort of react to some of these differences and help us sort of push things further and react to those discrepancies between the sort of the observed state and the desired state.
If somebody came to you and said, hey, I know you're going to a bunch of events here in the next couple of weeks, we talked about that. They said, hey, I want you to do a talk. You got 30 minutes, 45 minutes. I want you to do a talk and give us maybe 5 or 6 lessons you guys have learned over the last year just about, okay, we're thinking about taking on bringing AI, more automation into the systems that people use for their own software. The few things that you would kind of go, these are the most important lessons we learned. These are like the most important kind of decisions we made. And those are the things that allowed us to take on the next big step or avoid some big problem that we're going to run into.
Specifically with respect to adopting agentic software development?
Yeah, and just kind of because again, you guys you're taking on more capabilities. Obviously, there's more stuff going on there, and you want to be able to automate more of that in a trusted way. Yeah. I think you could apply those same principles to what a lot of companies are trying to figure out. Again, not necessarily like, vendor competitors of yourself, but just like, banks and insurance companies and other companies that have a lot of software. Are there 2 or 3 sort of like, these are the most important things that, you might pass along to somebody?
I mean, I'll give like one super loaded one.
Yeah.
I mean, I think the one single most important thing right now is to be enabling folks to be learning this stuff and kicking the tires on this stuff. I think that every company that is not embracing this stuff is doing everyone that works for them a disservice in terms of preparing them for what software development, looks like in the future. I think it's hard for me to sort of prescribe much beyond that because I don't think we are anywhere close to the final form of this thing. Like, I love Claude. Claude is not the final form of this thing. Do I think it's going away? No. It'll be around and it'll be useful, but I don't think it's the final form. And I don't think anyone really has conceived of what that final form is yet, whether it's OpenClaw or whatever else as a sort of higher level above that. But I think that, in terms of like folks starting to learn the fundamentals of agentic software development and how you interact with these things is a muscle that I was telling someone on our team, this is effectively like an existential career discussion to be having with the engineers on the team, right?
Yeah.
If they we sort of resist being like, yes, you have to be using these tools to be doing your job.
Right.
But I can say in the same breath that look, these things are making folks so much more effective that, that if you look at sort of in aggregate, like what performance of a team looks like over time, the folks who aren't using these things will sort of look like they have the productivity of folks handwriting assembly, in the next year or two, if not already, depending on how far ahead your team is on leveraging these tools. It is such a force multiplier for teams when used effectively. But how do you use it effectively? You need to experiment. You need to see what works. You need to, try and fail, right? So that you can learn what to do and what not to do. And it makes my head spin how fast it's changing too. And so it's not just something where it's like sit down and spend a week learning it. Like it is, taking continuous learning to new extremes. But I think the single most important thing that, folks need to be doing right now is, learning how to use these things at all, and then learning how to use these things well, not because that this is their final form, but because those sort of basic fundamentals are things that, are becoming the new normal for how we do software development day to day. And, all I know is that software development has already and will change completely in the next couple of years as these tools get progressively more powerful. And I don't think anyone knows what it will look like a couple of years from now. But folks who aren't preparing for it now are doing themselves a significant disservice by not wrapping their head around these tools and starting to learn them. And, I think, we are trying to be way out ahead of that because so much of what we do is codifying best practices and, being that trusted advisor for our customers as they try to navigate through this space. And so, we are trying to sort of lay tracks in front of the train in terms of how do we help folks responsibly adopt this stuff, just like we help them responsibly adopt, open source software, containers, libraries. We've started to offer hardened GitHub Actions for helping folks harden their CI/CD systems against the kinds of attacks that have happened. We're starting to harden skills where there's been a whole bunch of folks just publishing skills that do malicious things, right? So how do we help folks responsibly adopt these kinds of things and establish those best practices? I think that is very sort of top of mind for me, both for our own adoption, but in terms of helping our customers navigate that path.
Yeah, no, I think it's great. I had in my notes, I was going to ask you a question sort of about where you thought some of this stuff was going, but I think the reality is you answered it in probably the most valuable way to our audience, which is number one, this stuff is moving so fast. You could make a prediction, but the odds of your prediction being right are, they're whatever. But the feedback on like you said, the gap between sort of like curious to I'm using it a little bit to I'm using it in a productive way, the gaps between those things just become so big, so fast that, yeah, I think we've said this a number of times ourselves is you really, if you're in this industry or you're doing anything that has anything to do with, you're sort of touching technology, you have to be figuring out a way to embrace it because you're going to find out really quickly that the people that do, they just sort of get this superpower. They just sort of take off and you don't realize it until you are in sort of the middle of living with it and trying to learn the tools and trying to figure out how it works and so forth. So I appreciate you giving that feedback because I think it reinforces stuff that we've been seeing across a lot of different companies, across a lot of different industries. So, well, listen, Matt, like we said, we could go on a lot on a number of those topics. I appreciate you digging in, especially around kind of the design principles, what you guys learned, how you took things that, you had used in the past and now we're applying them to new things. So appreciate all of that stuff. Again, want to thank you for, kind of helping us dig into this because I think so much of this is going to be really valuable for, again, companies that realize that so much of what they do is software, whether they, again, are in the technology industry or they're in banking or they're in manufacturing. More and more is becoming software. So the more you can leverage open source, the more you can leverage secure software, the better off everybody's going to be. So thank you for your time. Folks, with that, I'm going to wrap it up. I want to thank Matt for this. And thank you all for listening. Thanks for telling a friend about the show and helping us grow the community. And with that, we're going to wrap it up, and we'll talk to you next week.
Check us out online at reasoning.show for all things reasoning. And leave a 5-star review wherever you listen to the show.